Welcome everybody and good morning. I'm going to give just a few seconds or moments here for everyone to continue trickling into our Zoom room before we get going. Get settled, get cozy, get coffee. Hope you're doing well. And now that you are settled in here, welcome again. My name is David Yoakum. I'm the director of the Policy Lab at Brown University. I have the honor of introducing our guest today, Austin Becker, who's going to be talking about how we can increase the resilience of coastal infrastructure to better serve our communities. I can tell you this is a topic that I've been looking forward to. Since I moved to Rhode Island a couple of years ago, I've been fascinated by our 400 miles of coastline as a natural asset, as well as all the types of things it takes to manage it. And it's the sort of issue that as you dive into it, it's endlessly fascinating in its own right, but also hugely important, not just for Rhode Island, not just for coastal states, but for all of the country that relies on the intersection between the ocean and the landmass, the ports that are there. It's really important to get these infrastructure decisions correct. And it's complicated, especially as climate change is increasing. And so we really have one of the best people in the world to talk to us about this in Dr. Becker, who I'm very pleased to introduce. Dr. Becker is an associate professor and director of graduate studies in the Department of Marine Affairs at the University of Rhode Island. For over 15 years, Dr. Becker has been doing research related to coastal infrastructure resiliency, how to communicate about storm impacts with emergency managers, perceptions of climate change among port administrators, the impacts of hurricanes, barriers to resilience, vulnerability assessments at U.S. ports, a wide variety of things that he's done research on. And he's done this with port authorities, with the U.S. Army Corps, with the American Society of Civil Engineers. He's worked with the United Nations, and so brings a wide perspective of expertise and personal experience on these topics that I'm very excited about. He's also, Dr. Becker, this isn't on your bio at URI, but I find it a very important detail. He was for a number of years the captain of an 18th century replica sailing ship, the Continental sloop Providence, which sounds awesome and want to know more about. And also has a Coast Guard captain's license, a 500-ton master, which sounds very impressive to me. I'm going to be envisioning Dr. Becker giving this talk as if he's in the top of a lighthouse on the side of the ocean, which he claims is not where he's doing his Zoom from, but I don't believe him. With that, everybody please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Becker to talk about coastal resiliency. The baton is yours, sir. Welcome.
All right, thanks for that intro. Yeah, I'm actually just sitting here in my house in Providence. So let me share my screen here and start this up. And I'm going to assume that that's working, so people can yell and scream and call me on my cell phone if it's not. Thanks so much. This is a great opportunity for me to synthesize a bunch of projects that I've been working on over the last 10 or 15 years. Yeah, I came to Rhode Island back in 2000 to run the sloop Providence, and I spent a lot of time sailing up and down Narragansett Bay, in and out of Providence Harbor and around other ports and harbors up and down the eastern seaboard in that part of my career. And I got very interested in kind of the intersection between working waterfronts, maritime infrastructure, and the coming climate crisis, and how climate change would impact these water-dependent uses. So I went back to URI in 2005 for a master's in marine affairs, worked for Sea Grant for a couple of years down at the Bay campus, and then went out to Stanford to do a PhD in this area, and then got hired back into the department in 2014. So I'm gonna talk about a variety of projects that all contribute to this theme of how can we increase the resilience of coastal infrastructure to better serve communities. So I'll be drawing on a number of projects that all contribute to trying to get at the answer to this question. And just to kind of roughly frame out the talk, I'm gonna hit these 5 topics. What's the problem? Why hasn't more been done? What can be done? What's being done? And what are we going to do next? So let's start with what's the problem? So, when it comes to coastal infrastructure and ports in particular, I spend a lot of my time researching ports because there's no plan B for ports and other coastal infrastructure. You really can't relocate these things. They really need to be right on the coast, as opposed to residential or restaurants or other commercial uses that benefit from being on the coast, but they don't have to be there. So coastal infrastructure is critical, complex, and constrained. It's critical because it's an economic engine from the very local scale. So in the case of the Port of Providence here, this is an energy port. So about 80% of the petroleum product for the state comes through the Port of Providence. And of course, 90% of the world's freight moves by ship. So our ports and our coastal infrastructure are really important for the global economy as well, and really at every scale in between. They're very complex. There are a lot of stakeholders that are interested and have an interest in what's going on the port and on the waterfront, that depend on the interface between the land and the sea. There's the private sector and there's the public sector that interface there. And they're also complex across time because this is infrastructure we're talking about, and infrastructure is designed to last many, many, many decades, sometimes 75 years or more. And if you go down to any port, any coastal city, you're going to find infrastructure that was constructed, over 100 years ago. In some cases, that's still in use today. And finally, they're constrained. So they are dependent on these very specific locations. They need deep water. They need some protection from the elements. They need other infrastructure in place: rail, pipelines, roads, highways, and such. And they're also located in very environmentally sensitive areas because our cities and ports grew in areas where there was good access to the sea and also good access to inland areas through river systems, which means that they're built on estuaries often. And these are very environmentally sensitive locations. So they're complex. They need to be in these sensitive locations. And, ports and coastal cities are, of course, already at risk. This is just a map of tropical storm tracks for the last 50 or 60 years or so. And you can see the green dots there. These are ports, but they're also coastal cities that are within 100 kilometers of a storm track in the last 50 or 60 years. So already at risk. And climate change brings really big additional challenges. So for our coastal cities and for our ports and coastal infrastructure, there's really three main drivers that we need to be thinking about with respect to climate change. The first is the potential for more of these Cat 4 and Cat 5 tropical storms. And 2020 has been a great example of this. So the current projections are not necessarily for more storms overall, but for more of the really big and powerful storms. The sea level rise, of course, and projections for sea level rise are still fairly wide ranging. Most are in the range of about 3/4 to 2 meters by 2100. But there are lots of projections that far exceed 2 meters. And in fact, we see some projections for places like Rhode Island with the potential for even 10 or 11 feet of sea level rise by 2100. And then lastly is increased heavy precipitation events. And if we take these three drivers and we bundle them together, as some researchers have done who are interested in risk and flood probabilities, what we find is that what is today the 1 in 100 year storm event, or the 1% annual storm event, could be the annual storm event by 2100. So this has really, really big implications for our coastal infrastructure and our coastal cities. The impacts of storm events and of sea level rise are also complex. So we can kind of start to break them down a little bit into some categories. We can think about the direct damages that occur from storm events. So this is the things that are broken or damaged that you can easily quantify. Like in this example, this is a refrigerated warehouse in Gulfport, Mississippi that was damaged in Hurricane Katrina. This was a refrigerated warehouse. So it stored, in this case, it was chickens and pork bellies, frozen chickens and frozen pork bellies. But these direct damages can be easily quantified. We can estimate how much it's going to cost to fix or rebuild that warehouse. The second are the indirect costs. So this is things like lost wages, interruptions to supply chains, cleanup costs, business interruptions. These things can be quantified, but they're a little bit more difficult to get at, and they usually require some more complex modeling. And then the last is the intangible consequences. And it turns out that these intangible consequences are really, really significant. So this is things like impacts to quality of life from lost jobs, for example, environmental damages, loss of services. And what we're looking at on the left here is, this is a headline. This was after Hurricane Katrina. And this is work that I did in my PhD. So I did some case studies, and I'm showing some of the results from that here. So rotten meat from Katrina still in Gulfport neighborhood. So this was a result of this warehouse that got blown out by a 28-foot storm surge that brought all of the products from this refrigerated warehouse, as well as containers and a bunch of other debris, up to 3 miles inland into the city of Gulfport. And that rotten meat sat in plastic bags in people's backyards, and it started to rot. And it was 9 months later when this article came out, and that still had not been cleaned up. So that meant that those neighborhoods were stinking of rotten meat for 9 months after this event. So that's an intangible consequence, but it really matters to those people who live in those neighborhoods. So these kinds of damages, they cost a lot of money. They they have other implications beyond the monetary costs. And here we're looking at some graphs of these different types of costs: the direct damages, the indirect costs, the intangible consequences. The N is the number of distinct damages that were identified through interviews with decision makers in these case study ports of Providence and Gulfport. And the takeaway here is that a lot of the costs from these kinds of storms at ports and other coastal infrastructure are costs that are going to be shared or are going to be paid by external stakeholders. So that's could be taxpayers, could be neighbors, could be the general public. And that only a fraction of them are going to be paid by the coastal infrastructure manager themselves. So in this case, we're looking at the port in red. They're going to pay for a lot of those direct damages here, but the rest of the direct damages are paid by a number of different stakeholders. And when it comes to the intangible consequences at the bottom, we see that the vast majority of these, the cost of these is shouldered by the external stakeholders, so that's the neighbors and the public and the environment, or shared between those stakeholders and the port. And the point of this is that when damage happens at these infrastructure facilities, whether it's a port or another type of infrastructure, the costs of that really distribute out across society, across certainly the neighbors and the region, but I think really society as a whole as externalities. So that makes them very complicated to deal with. The other thing to consider as we're talking about building resilience and how much it's going to cost and the cost of damage avoided and the cost of building structures and such is that any one coastal city or any one piece of infrastructure is not alone in this challenge. And so to think about it as a global problem, we need to start thinking about what the aggregate impacts are to the world's supply of resources. And we can talk about that in terms of dollars, but we can also talk about that in terms of materials. So this was from a study that we did to start getting a handle on what it would take in terms of raw materials and engineers and specialty ships to build a storm structure, a storm barrier around every port in the world. And so we looked at 220 of the top ports for this exercise, and we designed a generic structure, a protect structure. These are the four archetypal ways to build your resilience: to protect, to elevate, to abandon, and to design for submersion here. And so we built this generic structure. This is the Port of Boston, and this is our structure. This is the seaward piece of it, and then the landward berm is in the orange here. And by doing this for 220 ports, we were able to back out what it would take. We just looked at cement in this example, what it would take to armor all the world's ports against 6 feet of sea level rise. And it came out to 49 million metric tons of cement for this, which represents about 4% of the capacity, the excess capacity of cement production in the world. But this was, these 220 ports, this is just 220 of over 3,500 ports. So when you start kind of doing the math on how much materials it might take if every port or every coastal city decided to go with this barrier option, which of course many coastal cities are starting to think about. Boston's thinking about it, New York's thinking about it, other coastal cities are thinking about it as well. This really starts to add up, not just in terms of dollars, but really in terms of supply of materials or supply of engineers or specialty ships. So that's one way to start thinking globally about the problem. Another is really in terms of cost. So we did another project where we took 100 of the US coastal ports and did an exercise to estimate the cost of elevating those ports. So raising them up out of the floodplain. And this is a solution that Gulfport, Mississippi has done, and a couple of other ports around the world have started to do, especially in Japan. But not too many are doing this at this point. But if you want to get your infrastructure up and out of the floodplain so that you're not impacted by that storm surge or that sea level rise, this is one way to do it. Simply elevate the land, rebuild your infrastructure on top. And this is a solution that I think many ports will do in the next coming decades. So in this study, we estimated that it would take about somewhere between $57 and $78 billion to elevate 100 ports in the US. Now, of course, you can't just elevate the port because, as I said earlier, the ports need those connections to other infrastructure. So if you just elevate the port, you end up with an island. But you need to elevate the roads and the rail systems and other things too. But this is a way to just help us to start thinking about the scale of this problem. So $57 to $78 billion just for those 100 coastal ports. So I think this is still an emerging area of research. We have not been working on it for too long. This slide is from a survey that we did of the world's top ports about 10 years ago, in order to just get a baseline understanding of what ports were thinking about, how they were starting to tackle this problem, if they were starting to tackle this problem at all. And I just want to look in the chat and make sure there's nothing important that I'm missing here, as I see some chats. Oh, maybe not. Okay. Oops. Sorry, I've lost my. Okay. So we did this baseline survey. It was an online survey of port authorities in order to see what they were doing, if anything, at that point about climate change. And what we found was that they were certainly concerned about this as an emerging issue. So 81% of ports felt that they needed to address this problem, that it was an emerging problem that the ports community needed to tackle. But at that point anyway, not a whole lot had been done. So you see here, there's a few options for things that ports might have been doing with respect to adaptation. Do you have a specific policy document? Is it in your budget? Do you carry specific climate change insurance? And there were a few that indicated that they did, one or more of these things. But I'll say, when we followed up with these ports in order to have them send along the evidence of these, we were not able to find any evidence of actual policy documents that included adaptation, for example, at that time. So it was a very nascent issue 10 years ago, and that begs the question, why hasn't more been done since then? We've learned a lot in the last 10 years. We've learned a lot about climate change and climate science. We have pretty good projections around what we can expect. It's a broad range, but we know that sea level rise is coming. We know that even at the lower extremes, it's still likely to be a pretty big impact on our coastal infrastructure. So how come more hasn't already been done? So we did a study of, again, this was with seaports in the North Atlantic coast here. We looked at 15 seaports in the Northeast and conducted interviews with 30 of the port staff. This is work that I did with my research associate, Dr. Ellie McLean. So the reasons that they identified for not doing more to build resilience fell into these categories that you see around the outside of this radar plot. And a big one was lack of understanding of risk. So, all of the environmental specialists that we interviewed identified that the lack of understanding of risk was a big reason that they were not doing more to invest in resilience. They simply didn't understand what the risks were, and they needed more studies to be done to help them understand how it would impact their particular facility. Lack of funding, of course, this was identified by all the safety officers and 76% of the directors and 63% of the environmental specialists. Lack of funding, that's one to be expected. There's never enough money, especially when it comes to big infrastructure projects like this. The perceived risk doesn't exceed the action threshold. So in this case, people told us that they understood that there was a risk, but it wasn't enough of a risk to actually compel them to make an investment to lower that risk. And that could be that's a reasonable decision in many cases. But this is something that they identified as, in particular, those safety officers talked about this. There are physical constraints that make it very difficult to make changes to infrastructure. In the Port of Boston, for example, the container cranes are limited in height because they are in the flight path of Logan Airport. So you can't raise that elevation any more than it already is without interfering with the flight path for Logan Airport. And there's lots of other physical constraints that that infrastructure has to deal with. In some cases, there are governance disconnects. So some people are, climate deniers, and some people are climate change believers. And that can interfere with decision making, or sometimes it's just a question of who has jurisdiction and who has mandate over certain kinds of decision making. And then finally, for some people, not very many, thankfully in this case, but people did talk about this just being a problem that's too overwhelming to deal with, and so they simply do nothing. So another barrier in terms of incorporating sea level rise guidance into design was that that guidance simply doesn't exist. So this was from a survey of maritime infrastructure engineers that we did about a year ago. We worked with the American Society of Civil Engineers, and we conducted a survey of infrastructure engineering firms across the US and asked those engineers whether they used a specific policy or planning document to tell them how to incorporate sea level change into the design of their coastal infrastructure. And some did, most did not. And they indicated that the reason that they're not incorporating sea level change is that in many cases, they don't have the right guidance. So, you see the circled answers here where we were asking why they didn't incorporate sea level change into their port infrastructure projects. They said there's no standards, 36 people said that. There's no codes, there's no nationwide guidance, there's no local guidance, there's no state guidance, there's lack of consistent guidance, and there's differing guidance from multiple sources. So the takeaway from this is that engineers are really wanting clear guidance that helps them to make decisions about how much sea level rise to incorporate into their designs, and for what different timescales and what different projects. And at the moment, this is happening in kind of an ad hoc way. And so sometimes it ends up not being incorporated at all, simply because that guidance doesn't exist. And then the last barrier that I'll talk about is leadership. And leadership for coastal resilience and climate adaptation is a real big challenge. This is from a study we did here in Providence, where we interviewed stakeholders of the Port of Providence, and among other questions, we asked who should take the lead in implementing resilience strategies. And you can see in this word graph here that there were lots of ideas about which particular organizations or agencies should be responsible for taking the lead. And there isn't a real clear answer to this. There's no, in Rhode Island, of course, we don't have a port authority for the Port of Providence. But even if you did have a port authority, taking the lead on this is difficult because it's significant investment, and it requires bringing a lot of stakeholders together in collaboration. And there are not always clear incentives. So, the incentive for building resilience and making investments is in damages avoided, and damages avoided potentially far into the future. And it's tough for any particular political leader to throw their weight behind, avoiding damages in the future when they're not likely to be in office anymore, for example. Businesses tend to not be thinking on the 5, 10, or 20-year time horizon. They're really thinking about the next quarter or maybe the next year or two. So it's not real clear where this leadership should come from at this point. So what can we do? Well, the good news is there's a lot that can be done. And what we're looking at here is a graph, a bar graph showing the unique strategies that were mentioned by decision makers and stakeholders in just 2 different case studies, in Gulfport and in Providence. And they fell into these 7 different broad categories. So there were 6 specific long-range planning efforts that people discussed. There were 10 specific types of insurance policies that people discussed, et cetera. And there were 128 of these unique strategies that decision makers and stakeholders talked about as being possible and feasible to do in order to build resilience for that coastal infrastructure system as a whole. And so I'll add to this that there's a lot that can be done, and there are also a lot of different types of stakeholders that have some role in this. So what we're looking at here on the left are those strategies that you saw just in that last graph. So building codes and land use regulations, and there's 10 specific ones here. Long-range planning efforts, there's 6 specific long-range planning efforts that people talked about, construction and design approaches, et cetera. So these are those 128 different resilience building strategies. And along the top, we're looking at the different kind of archetypal stakeholders of a port system here that have a stake in what's going on at the port and could potentially take the lead or play a large role in implementing these various strategies. So we have the Port Authority, the external stakeholders of the port, which is like the tenants and the shippers and such, our public policy folks on the different levels, federal, state, and local, our community and environmental groups, and then the research community. So here we're looking at how these different strategies distribute across these different stakeholder groups in terms of who is poised to implement these different types of strategies. So in this example, those strategies that take place off of port land. So think about that storm barrier. If the strategy selected is to build a big storm barrier, like say in the Port of Boston, to protect the whole harbor there, well, stakeholders, there's 4 of these types of strategies that could be in the domain of the Port Authority. There's 4 that could be in the domain of federal policymakers, like the Army Corps of Engineers. There were 10 of these types of strategies that could be led by state agencies, such as the Coastal Resources Management Council, et cetera. And if we look across all of these different strategies and all of these different stakeholder groups, what we find is that these resilience building strategies distribute across the entire system of stakeholders. So everybody here, everybody who's part of the system can contribute something to developing the collective resilience of the system as a whole. And I think this is something that often gets forgotten when we're talking about building resilience of our coastal infrastructure. I think there's a tendency to think that one entity, be it the Army Corps of Engineers, or be it a port authority, or be it a specific business, that one entity is going to take that responsibility on. And I think this is a bigger problem than can be handled by any one of these entities. And the real challenge for us is going to be finding ways to come together to recognize the collective risk that we all share, and also the collective responsibility that we have to play a role in building resilience, whether that's through political will and the power of the vote, or making investments in specific pieces of infrastructure, or other types of things. So when we talk to port directors themselves, they mentioned some more specific strategies. So conducting risk assessments. And again, these are the different types of strategies that were mentioned in those interviews of those at those 15 ports in the North Atlantic. And the ones that rose to the top were conduct these risk assessments, get a better handle of what the risks actually are. Foster collaborations. This came up a lot, that in this case, these port authorities, they wanted to work with other stakeholders to work collectively to try to address the resilience issues. Regulatory changes are going to be really important. We saw that in the case of those of the infrastructure engineers. They need policy, they need regulatory guidance to give them something to lean on in order to make the kinds of changes that they may think are necessary. And then developing financial incentives. We can build financial incentives into grant programs for infrastructure, and or through insurance policies or that kind of thing. So what's actually being done thus far? There's a lot being done. There's a lot of ports and a lot of coastal infrastructure is doing resilience assessment and vulnerability assessment. There are changes being made. The Army Corps of Engineers has been working with the Department of Homeland Security on developing a guide to help different aspects of the maritime transportation system to build resilience and to conduct these resilience assessments. So they're developing best practices that they can hand off to ports or other parts of the supply chain to help them conduct one of these assessments in an efficient way. And as part of this guide process, this guide is slated to come out early in 2021. And it's a real collaborative effort. And as part of this, my group at URI is trying to call out some of the best practices and the value of doing these resilience assessments from ports, in this case, ports that have gone through this process already. So we're doing case studies of 10 ports in the US that have done a vulnerability assessment in order to identify what the people who participated in that found valuable about that process and how it changed the way they do business at the port, how it changed the institutional culture of the port when it comes to resilience. And finally, what they actually did differently. Did they actually carry out the recommendations that were made in their assessment? So, we're finding so far, we've done about half of these interviews, and my grad student Ellis Kalajian has been working on this. And we have found thus far preliminary results that institutional capacities have really improved after doing an assessment like this. That assessments often lead to additional assessments, and I think that's a good thing, because that you start with a broad overview of what some of the issues might be, and then you really need to drill down in some of the more specific aspects of your vulnerability through much more targeted assessment processes. And we are seeing that the resilience assessment or the vulnerability assessment is leading to a higher capacity for adaptation. So I'm going to give you just an example of an assessment here. This was a vulnerability assessment process that we ran in the Port of Providence. This was back in 2014-15, where we worked with the 30 businesses of the port, and with Rhode Island Department of Transportation funding, we developed a vulnerability assessment and a workshop process that brought together these different stakeholders to help them talk about what the risks are from a major hurricane event, and how they felt about different approaches to resilience building. So part of that process was to develop a storm scenario, and to basically talk with their neighbors about what a major storm scenario might do to their business and how that would affect the neighboring businesses. And also we looked at these 4 archetypal approaches to building resilience: protect, relocate, accommodate, and do nothing, and evaluated with our participants how well these different approaches would serve their resilience needs. And so, this was one of the proposals, was building a storm barrier like this down at the mouth of the Providence River here. So this is, Save the Bay is here. Downtown Providence is up here. Our existing hurricane barrier is here. And this proposal was a new hurricane barrier that would protect the entire port area from a storm surge. And we looked at each one of these strategies was fleshed out into more detail. And then we did this decision tool in order to evaluate how well these different approaches would meet the resilience goals of this particular group of stakeholders. And what the point of this was not to choose a direction to go in. It was really to just start us thinking about, well, what are some of the issues? What are some of the options that might be on the table, and how do we generate some dialogue that can lay the groundwork for moving any of these ideas forward? So this was a vulnerability assessment exercise, and the last project that I'm going to talk about is a current project, which is working more directly with the emergency management community. So this project, hazard consequence threshold models for emergency management response and long-term planning. This is an ongoing project that we conducted a case study in Providence. And the purpose of this project is to help with communication around impacts of storm events, potential impacts of storm events. So, when we're talking about a storm coming up the coast and impacting our infrastructure or our communities, we're typically looking at storm surge models, wave models, wind models, things that tell us, how much flooding we might expect. Sometimes we're able to also couple these with damage functions to tell us what % of a building might be damaged. But what we really need when it comes to storm prediction is the really localized consequences that we need to be thinking about as a storm comes up the coast. So the purpose of this project, which is being funded by Department of Homeland Security, is to couple qualitative data. So that's what's the problem? What keeps you up at night as a storm is coming up the coast? What are you worried about? Those pieces of information, coupling those with what the numerical storm models are actually predicting in terms of the level of surge we can expect, the level of wind we can expect, the waves we might be able to expect. So bringing those two pieces together, the qualitative data around what people, what experts, what locals are actually worried about with these storm models, so that we can make some predictions around the, what we should be concerned with. So what we're looking at in this image is called a mesh. This is a grid mesh. The mesh represents the amount of flooding that is predicted. And in this case, we're looking at the Port of Providence here. And it's a very fine, high resolution mesh. So we can resolve across a parcel like this, the expected flooding on one side of the parcel versus the other side of the parcel. And that allows us to look at specific assets at these different facilities. So for example, maybe a transformer, electrical transformer. We can look at the elevation of that and get an understanding of what the consequences might be from that getting inundated, and then use those numerical storm models to help us understand whether or not that's something that should be on the radar or not. So we did 2 pilot studies thus far in this project. The first was in Westerly, Rhode Island, and the second in Providence. And we focused on critical infrastructure that was on the coast. And through site visits and interviews and focus groups, we elicited the worries, the concerns of these different infrastructure facility managers. And we called each concern a consequence threshold. And the consequence threshold consists of these different data points: the specific asset, so be it a generator or a entryway to a building or a HVAC unit. And then what are the consequences of that particular asset being damaged by flooding or wind or wave action? And we take all of these consequence thresholds and we put them into a database and a dashboard system. And so this is a mock-up of our dashboard system. And then we can play our storm scenario through time. And as the surge advances, these different consequences get triggered, and we can click on these, or the emergency manager can click on these and get a sense of what the worries are with respect to that consequence. So I'm going to just show you what this could look like. The dashboard is one approach to sharing this information, and then this is another one. Here we're looking at Westerly, and this is a storm scenario called Hurricane Rhodey. This is a plausible extreme storm event that was developed by Isaac Guinness's group in the Graduate School of Oceanography here at URI. The yellow represents the surge, and the pins are these consequence thresholds that get triggered. So the blue ones are wind, the red ones are inundation, the yellow ones that you'll see in a minute are 8 inches of flooding over a roadway. And this particular consequence example came from the fire chief, and they say that if the winds are more than 70 miles an hour, they worry that they're going to lose this particular antenna, and they'll lose some communications capacity with their field teams. So here we're 30 minutes into this storm event. The wind has started to increase. The surge has started, but there's not too much of it yet. And just this one threshold has been triggered here, this inundation greater than 1 foot, and they're not going to be able to reach the homes at the lighthouse. So we're going to advance in time. We're 30 minutes in, and now we're an hour and 30 minutes in to this storm event. And the surge has gotten much worse, and there's many roadways with 8 inches of water over the roadway, which is the threshold at which emergency vehicles can't pass. And we're seeing a number of other consequences get triggered as well. And then we'll go 2 hours into this event, and we see a few more consequences get triggered. And these are the flags that we provide to the emergency management community to say, okay, this is something that the storm prediction is saying this might happen at this point in the storm track. So this is something we're actively working on with Rhode Island Emergency Management right now. And it's been ongoing for the last 5 years with Department of Homeland Security funding. So where are we going next? one of the immediate next steps for us is to continue that project that I just mentioned. So develop our dashboard more, integrate it with the Emergency Operations Center at Rhode Island Emergency Management, develop a better way of collecting data from our infrastructure managers across the state. So we're moving to an app-based data collection approach instead of site visits and interviews. And then do trainings with the emergency management community so that they can utilize this dashboard in conjunction with the other tools that they're already using in the Emergency Operations Center. We've also just kicked off a new project in Newport with Naval Station Newport and the 3 communities, Portsmouth, Middletown, and Newport, to do a vulnerability assessment that uses some of these tools that I've talked about. To help understand what the consequences of storm events and sea level rise may be for these communities, and to develop some strategies to prioritize investments in resilience building. So I'm going to end now with kind of a concept of why I think this is such a hard, why climate change is such a hard problem for us people to deal with. And I think in many ways it comes down to the way we think about problems and time and what we are actually doing. So on the bottom of this slide, you see this is a timeline that goes out to 2150 and beyond. The present is on the left here. And we know that the impacts of climate change are going to be on the rise over the next century, and that they're going to continue to rise after this arbitrary 2100 number. And we're okay at thinking about the next year in our lives, like we have a pretty good handle as people on what we might be doing in 6 months or a year. 5 to 10 years, things get a little foggier for us, but we may have a 5 to 10 year plan, or we may be looking at a career change in 5 or 10 years, or trying to build something, looking towards a new living situation, or having kids or something like that. We might think about 5 to 10 years out. And after that, who really thinks about what they're going to accomplish in their entire career? Maybe some people do, or the rest of our lives, or what's going to be happening over the course of our children's lives. And I'll remind you that kids born in the US today, over 50% of kids born today will live to be over 105 years old. So when we start spending the time to think about our children's lives, or maybe our grandchildren's lives, we're really, the implications of what we decide today really, really matter for that 2100 number. And it especially matters when we're thinking about these big infrastructure projects, like building the storm barrier in Rotterdam. Selection and engineering and design of these can take 10 years. Permitting and regulatory processes can take 10 years. Construction can take 5 years. And they typically have a design life of 50 years, but an actual working life of much more than 75. So, the decisions that we're making about these big infrastructure projects, the decisions we're making today, they're really going to matter out into this area of time that's very difficult to think about, but I think very important to think about. So I'll end here with just what we're trying to do with my group of students at URI and elsewhere. We have a big group of students that have worked on all of these projects over the years. They're really team efforts, and we've gotten funding from a lot of different sources to support the work as well, and we're really grateful for that, and look forward to continuing on with some of this work. So let me stop my share here, and boy, look at all those questions. Yowzers. Okay, and we can take some questions.
Fabulous, Austin. Thanks so much. Let me try to synthesize maybe and package together a few of the questions, of which there's some really great ones in the chat. So thanks for everybody who's dropping them. One cluster of questions, and this is coming from Baylor and Kathy and others, I kind of interpret as trying to help sharpen our intuitions about the predictions in this space. And so, if it turns out that the sea level rises by 1.5 or 2.5 meters, sort of really, what are the implications for how drastically that changes the type of planning that needs to be done in terms of these port changes? And a slightly different version of that that's in here, I think, is asking that if it's going to be a lot of uncertainty there, does that have implications for the design of ports in ways that maybe we should be building kind of smaller and more agile so that they can be updated more frequently?
Yeah, so yes, I think that there are opportunities to build things in a way that they can be updated more easily in the future. I also think that, you know, we need to recognize that things can't stay like they are, that, you know, we cannot afford to protect every port or every community or every part of the city. And that's really hard for us to internalize, I think. But, you know, I think if we look at this realistically, we're gonna need to do some relocating, some consolidating of infrastructure in some areas, and we really could use some high level, you know, national planning assistance with that, and that's not something that this country is particularly good at.
So Sean O'Rourke asked whether changes in the types of goods that might be landing in ports has implications for decision making about how to reform port facilities. And, you know, thinking about your point for petroleum products landed in Providence Port and the shift to energy use over the next 50 to 100 years, for example.
Yeah. I mean, it's a great question, and, you know, certainly well, not certainly, but probably the use of a port like Providence for energy, jet fuel, petroleum products in the future is very likely to change, and that gives us an opportunity to think about, you know, how we want to utilize that industrial land, that, you know, coastal industrial land, for something else, or you know, maybe that's an opportunity to reduce some of the use and some of the risk there. You know, I think that those are big strategic, you know, economic strategy questions, I think, that are worth looking at, because, yeah, of course, yeah, where the energy use is going to change.
There's several questions in here about kind of who's going to pay for this and how to finance it. And so Timmons Roberts is asking, for instance, your thoughts about lawsuits against port facility operators who don't fortify hazardous facilities in spite of all of the risk. And what's your take on this?
Yeah, and I think there's some ongoing litigation with the Conservation Law Foundation at a number of port facilities in Boston and Providence and elsewhere. You know, I think that this really raises the importance of these early dialogues around how risk distributes across a system. That, you know, making the assumption that a particular piece of infrastructure is going to deal with this on their own, or can afford to deal with this on their own as part of their business model. I mean, I think that they're going to play a role in it, but it's a societal problem. And I think that, you know, leaving it just to the facilities themselves without assistance and without collaboration with other stakeholders is probably going to result in a lot more of these kinds of lawsuits. You know, but like exercises like that vulnerability assessment that we did in Providence can help to, you know, facilitate communication and really identify how different stakeholders, including the port, including those energy facilities, can play a role in this in a more coordinated way.
Rini Myers has a question about to what extent nature-based infrastructure can be incorporated into maritime facilities to sort of improve kind of the adaptive capacity for ports.
Yeah, I haven't seen a lot of great examples of that for infrastructure like this. You know, we do see ports that are doing some like mitigation banking where they're doing some green solutions in other areas that are not right in front of the port. But I think the particular needs of a port anyway, with the need for deep water and such, generally we're going to be talking about more kind of hard solutions for this particular infrastructure. which isn't to say that there aren't opportunities kind of off of the port lands to help reduce some of that risk. But I think when it comes to the infrastructure itself, I haven't seen any great examples of nature-based solutions yet for this particular use.
Here's a question from Elizabeth Fussell noting that hardening the kind of protective infrastructure around a port might resolve a lot of the issues you're describing, but it might not address or might even stymie some of the needs of the local community around the port. Just curious your reflections on how to kind of balance those concerns.
Yeah, you know, it's complicated. It's a very complicated question. You know, I've typically looked at the infrastructure itself because it can't be moved. You know, people don't need to live in these areas necessarily. I mean, it could be very difficult for them to move, but it is possible to, you know, it doesn't have to be there. So perhaps there's some ways to look at, you know, protecting the use for that coastal infrastructure, but relocating what can be relocated in order to, you know, but I mean, you know, I don't have a good answer on that one, I'm afraid. You know, it's.
Matt Santa Cruz asked, after noting that Connecticut established its own port authority, should Rhode Island consider its own port authority?
Yes, technically there is a port authority in Rhode Island, but its focus is more on Quonset-Davisville. The issue with the Port Authority for Providence is that the state doesn't own very much land there. And so without owning some of the land, it's hard to really have jurisdiction over that land. So there's it's a cluster of private, well, and city-owned assets there. But I do think a Port Authority would be a great move for the Port of Providence, because there, you know, if nothing else, just to kind of bring these stakeholders together on a regular basis to try to find some joint solutions.
So Austin, thanks for a wonderful presentation. And also we covered a lot of question ground right there in the last.
There's a lot of questions there. Thank you, everybody.
There's more in there that we're unfortunately not going to be able to get to. And so actually, before I close this out though, Austin, do you have any recommendations for those who want to learn more or stay in touch? Anything you want to point them to?
Well, we have a website which is not totally up to date, but does have some more information about this, and that's web.uri.edu/abecker. And people are really welcome to follow up with me. You can email me, abecker@uri.edu. I'm happy to share any. So, you know, I went through a lot of the different papers that we've written over the years. I'm happy to share those papers, and I'm happy to talk more as well with individuals.
Really wonderful, Austin. I know I speak on behalf of everyone in saying thank you. And for everybody, if you enjoyed talking about this issue and sort of grappling with what science has to offer to our decisions about how we're governing ourselves, I'd encourage you to come check out the Policy Lab more. You can go to thepolicylab.brown.edu. Also want to thank our co-collaborators in bringing this event together at the Institute of Brown for Environment and Society. Appreciate all of your help on this. And it's wonderful to see everybody. Austin, thank you again.
Thank you, everybody.
Rest of your day.
Thanks, Policy Lab.